Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate your patience, especially after lunch, which is always the hardest session to undertake. And thank you to the organisers for also agreeing. Tom and I have worked on defence industrial projects for our Department of Defence for a number of years now. So when I was asked to present here, it made a logic sense. So we've basically divided the paper in two. So I'll start and Tom will finish. I'll start with a bit of an introduction and then sort of an explanation of the concepts and drivers for Australian defence industry and an outline of where it sits at the moment, which I think is very much fitting in what many of the others have done. So Australia's 2023 Defence Strategic Review and 2024 National Defence Strategy identified an end of 10 years of strategic warning time in the Indo-Pacific, placing a premium on outfitting Australian Defence Force for conventional deterrence. Successive governments have thus placed new premiums on greater defence funding, accelerated procurement for priority programs, and developing and transitioning advanced capabilities into service, objectives which permeated, as was mentioned before, in the 2024 Australian Defence Industrial Development Strategy. Now, given the limitations within Australia's own industrial base, they have also sought to both expand and deepen Australia's international defence industrial and technology partnerships with familiar allies like the United States and the United Kingdom, and with new partners in Europe and Northeast Asia. As it formulates the next National Defence Strategy in 2026, Australia must grapple with trade-offs about balancing industrial self-sufficiency with international cooperation, managing multiple international partnerships and adequate resourcing defence procurement projects under fiscal constraints, amongst other challenges. There are some really key concepts and drivers for the state of Australia's defence industry. Australia's approach to defence industrial strategy is built off the back of several major concepts and drivers: a complex interplay between strategy, local industry promotion, the desire for the highest quality cutting-edge technology, the US alliance politics, strategic geography, and the national defence budget. At the macro level, the principal drivers for Australia's strategic settings have been the alliance with the United States and the strategic environment of the Indo-Pacific. From the early 1970s until relatively recently, the focus was on the Defence of Australia doctrine. That approach was aimed at protecting the nation across a so-called air-sea gap to Australia's north and responding to potential low-level threats from a small or middle power in Australia's immediate region. With the risks low and no direct threat to Australia, the Australian Defence Force, or the ADF, was built around the concept of a balanced force with roughly equal weighting between each of the three military services, and the use of force for the independent of US combat forces to protect Australia other than against a major power threat. In order to execute this plan and gain access to US equipment and technology was deemed essential to achieve what was called a regional military capability edge over any power in Southeast Asia. This approach and the desire for high levels of interoperability with the United States military drove the development of a world-class, specialist but relatively small defence research and development sector in Australia in areas such as electronic warfare, advanced radar systems, and undersea capabilities. It also drove from the 1960s an increasing use of US platforms in the ADF. But to offset any potential dependency on the US defence industrial complex, the ADF also regularly partnered with European countries or defence companies. This included the purchase in the 1970s and 80s of French Mirage fighter aircraft, German Leopard tanks, British small arms, and Oberon-class submarines. Later on, Australia also partnered with a Swedish national defence company to design and build the Collins-class submarines. This approach lasted well into the first decade of the 21st century. Many of these capability decisions around European designs, partnerships or purchases were also driven by a desire by government to maintain a vibrant Australian defence industry through maximising Australian defence industrial content in capability projects. In the case of the Navy and some parts of the Army, this included collaboration with European partners for the construction or assembly in Australia of major platforms, such as German MECO frigates, Spanish air warfare destroyers, and German combat reconnaissance vehicles. These partners were often seen as more flexible in their approach compared to US companies, particularly in terms of local build, construction and maintenance, and their conditions around technology sharing. European designs are often seen as better scaled and more competitively priced for the ADF compared with US capabilities. However, these platforms were rarely straight off-the-shelf purchases, and many platforms, particularly Army and Navy capabilities, were, more often than not, adjusted to accommodate US combat systems and sensors, as well as locally produced and designed add-ons, such as electronic warfare capabilities, sensors, or combat interfaces. The government's aim was to develop and maintain a level of Australian defence industry that could support this Defence of Australia doctrine. Although the US industrial base was regarded as a major source of additional capacity in circumstances required, in the 1986 DIB review nevertheless noted, and I'll quote, "Diversification of our overseas supply sources is an added element of insurance, especially in circumstances in which the United States would be unwilling or unable to supply materials in quantities and timeframes we require." End quote. In terms of local construction, Australian defence industry capacity has often followed a seemingly boom and bust cycle like Trevor was talking about, driven in some part by the small size of the ADF's combat forces. For instance, often a factory would be built and a workforce developed to produce a specific platform for the ADF, but after a short production run, the factory would go into abeyance and the workforce dissipated, with the cycle only to be repeated several years later. One impact of this approach was frequent cost overruns and production delays, making locally produced defence capability much more expensive than foreign military sales and limiting export opportunities to international partnerships. Between the 1990s and early 2010s, a period of economic rationalism and just-in-time approach to economics and critical supply chains raised serious questions about the nature and the purpose of Australian defence industrial production. For much of Australian defence industry, maintenance and sustainment of in-service capabilities, often purchased from overseas rather than local manufacture, became the focus in order to maximise both profitability and to secure long-term government contracts. This approach meant the defence industry in Australia remained relatively small and highly mixed in terms of origin, source, and reflective of the ADF's range of mixed source equipment, with defence capabilities generating a significant maintenance and sustainment burden, although unevenly distributed between the military services. For instance, the Royal Australian Navy operates a fleet of ships without virtually any common industrial origin connecting to them or consistency across their chief features and chief systems. For example, Spanish Navantia designed Australian modified and built air warfare destroyers, German MECO frigates, modified and built in Australia with a Saab combat system interface, Australian CEA radars, Swedish designed, Australian modified and built diesel-electric submarines with a US combat system, with Mark 41 torpedoes and an Australian Thales bespoke sonar system and sensors. In contrast, the Royal Australian Air Force, since the 1980s, consolidated its fleet of aircraft based on US platforms, including the FA-18 Super Hornet, the E-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft, and we're the only country outside the US to operate that, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter, and the P-8 Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft. The only aircraft the Royal Australian Air Force operates that is not of US origin is the Italian C-27J Spartan transport aircraft, and it was purchased on the belief that the US Air Force would actually acquire this capability, but they backed out at the very last minute and left us operating the Ferrari of transport aircrafts. The Royal Australian Army, though, is the least dependent on US equipment. Now, overall, this has created an Australian defence industry that is overwhelmingly built around small to medium enterprises, or SMEs, with an emphasis on the small. In the Australian Bureau of Statistics, a small business is between 5 and 19 employees, a medium enterprise between 20 and 200 employees. In the Australian defence sector, the average supplier employs only 13 people. and achieves a net annual sales of about 2.2 million Australian dollars. Now, overall, there are 70,000 people are employed across over 5,500 businesses supplying defence, most of which, though, are in the professional, scientific or services sectors, followed on by construction, manufacturing, and then a small number spread over education and training, supply services, safety, energy, and logistics. Significantly, there are no truly Australian prime defence companies. Most of the primes in Australia are functions as local outlets of US or international defence companies such as Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, BAE Systems and Thales. Now, Australian SMEs, though, are not without their value. Many of these entities have produced world-leading capabilities that have been adopted into service by Australia and other key partners like the United States. And the war in Ukraine has demonstrated, as we heard in the first session, the flexibility and innovation of small and medium enterprises who have made outsized contributions to military firepower, notably through the development of things such as drone technology. These companies are the focus of initiatives like the Australian Strategic Capabilities Accelerator, or ASCA, established in May 2023 to facilitate rapid identification, development and entry into service of disruptive and emerging technologies and capabilities to meet urgent operational needs. Other key Australian companies include CEA Technologies, who produces world-class phased array radars that equip the Royal Australian Navy ships and ground-based radars for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance and air defence. The company is seen as so important to the Australian Defence Force that in July of 2023, the Australian government acquired an ownership stake in the company, basically to stop Northrop Grumman from buying it and moving it to the United States. Another key company is Austal Australia. Started in Western Australia in 1988, it is now a global shipbuilder with modern shipyards located in Western Australia, the United States of America, Vietnam and the Philippines. Austal has delivered and continues to construct more than 300 vessels for 100 operators in 54 countries around the world. Under a new 2025 Australian Commonwealth Government Strategic Shipbuilding Agreement, Austal is now the government's principal shipbuilder, with external designers going to deliver 18 landing craft medium, 8 landing craft heavy for the Australian Army, as well as the Megami-class frigates for the Royal Australian Navy in partnership with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. Now, the good news is that Australian defence industry continues to grow. In 2022-23, Defence awarded over $38 billion in contracts to Australian defence companies, accounting for 52% of all government procurement contracts across the whole of government. This has also seen some shift in the direction of larger businesses. In the same period, there was an 8.8% increase in the number of medium businesses and an 8% increase in the number of large businesses in the defence sector from the previous year. In 2023-24, Australian defence industry contributed over $11.9 billion to Australia's gross value add, up 12.4% from the previous year, and employment was up 9.1%. This is because we're into a new era and new direction. The primary driver of growth in Australia's defence industry has been a fundamental reappraisal of the nation's strategic circumstances. While Australia has grappled with implications of the rise of China since 2009, it was only with the 2023 Defence Strategic Review that the basis for Australian industrial and military strategy was fundamentally updated. The DSR, as it's called, formally ended Australia's Defence of Australia era, proposing a new concept of national defence in its place. National defence ended 10 years of strategic warning time for major conflict, updated the risk level from low-level conflict to major war, and placed strategic competition between China, the US and its allies and partners at the centre of Australian defence planning. Importantly, national defence calls for a whole-of-government and whole-of-nation approach, emphasising the need to harness all elements of national power to manage the risk of near-term major war in the Indo-Pacific. It is these concepts which have reshaped the strategic and defence industry planning basis for Australian defence policy. Both the DSR and the subsequent 2024 National Defence Strategy posted industry as a critical enabler of and requirement for Australia's national security. Although through these two documents, the Australian government has formally recognised its defence industry vulnerabilities and articulated a desire to support, grow and enable innovation and capacity within the Australian defence ecosystem. Innovation and research and development is central to that agenda, with the government pursuing the creation of new mechanisms to support AUKUS Pillar 2 and the establishment of the Advanced Strategic Capabilities Accelerator. The DSR and National Defence Strategy also emphasise the need to accelerate and streamline defence acquisition processes, expand sovereign capability in critical areas including shipbuilding, the fuel industry and critical and science and technology industries. And the DSR explicitly connected economic security with national security, highlighting the need to recruit, train and skill more Australians for jobs in defence-related industries to enhance national resilience. Critical to enabling this approach has been the establishment of a national support division within defence to connect industry to defence needs in the time of war or conflict, and the establishment of the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Enterprise Group to grow missile and weapons manufacturing in Australia. Likewise, the 2024 National Defence Strategy also placed a focus on national resilience, industrial resilience, supply chain resilience, a workforce and skills base, and innovation, science and technology. This was attached to an ambitious reform agenda. Out of this document, as we heard, came the Defence Industry Development Strategy, or DIDS, which identified 7 sovereign industrial priorities for the government: maintenance, repair, overhaul and upgrade of Australian Defence Force aircraft, continuous naval shipbuilding and sustainment and enhancement of the Combined Arms Land System, domestic manufacture of guided weapons, the development of integrated autonomous systems, the integration and enhancement of battle space awareness and management systems, and test and evaluation, certification and system assurances. Most recently, the government reform announced only last week was a new statutory defence acquisition agency under a Director of National Armaments that will be established next year. The DDA is designed to address a trouble-plagued defence acquisition process, which the Albanese government has consistently noted is running 28 different projects, running a combined 97 years over time when it came into office. Although much of this focus on sovereign defence capability and domestic economics, the emphasis in the National Defence Strategy on allies and partners and the need for collective deterrence and the immediacy of Australia's capability requirements has meant that contemporary Australian defence industry strategy continues to lean heavily on international partnerships. Central to these efforts have been deepening bilateral defence industrial collaboration with the United States and exploring new capability partnerships with Japan and South Korea, as well as pursuing several unilateral defence industrial partnerships focused on capability and technology development and supply chain integration, most notably famous being the AUKUS enterprise.
Thank you, Pete. I will pick up on the different international partnerships that Australia has pursued in support of its defence industrial strategy. I will begin with the United States as the most obvious point of departure. Australia has sought to expand the aperture of alliance defence industrial and technology cooperation beyond simply procuring and maintaining US-made weapon systems for the Australian Defence Force. These efforts are guided by Australia's perception of changes in its regional strategic circumstances, as Peter just outlined, where US military dominance in Asia has ended and US unfettered access to and across the Indo-Pacific in a conflict scenario would not necessarily be guaranteed. As such, Australia has sought to situate defence industrial cooperation with the United States both as a key enabler of a more capable ADF, but also as a key enabler of an enduring long-term US presence in Asia and an enabler of the alliance's full spectrum defence agenda more broadly. Australia has sought to expand its maintenance, repair and overhaul capacity for alliance forces across all domains. This has chiefly involved expanding the capacity of US primes in Australia's defence industrial marketplace to conduct deep maintenance and regular sustainment of US rotational forces and, by extension, to provide similar services to the ADF. In recent years, these companies have been certified to carry out much more extensive maintenance on US origin aircraft, including the P-8A Maritime Patrol aircraft, the MH-60R naval helicopter, and the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter. Australian companies will also be certified to maintain and sustain forward-positioned US Army capabilities under a September 2024 bilateral military logistics agreement. And these initiatives directly support upgrades to Australia's northern bases to support a higher tempo of operations by combined forces, including US aircraft, quote, of all types, end quote. Australia has also sought to deepen alliance supply chain integration for precision munitions, leveraging US assistance to support its guided weapons and explosive ordnance initiative. This effort has initially focused on co-assembly arrangements, upscaling production capacity for essential components like rocket motors, and the transfer of US technology and technical data to streamline production and sustainment for specific land-focused systems, including 155mm artillery rounds and guided multiple launch rocket systems, or GIMLRS. However, cooperation is expanding further to more sophisticated weapons like the Precision Strike Missile, the Mk-48 torpedo, the SM-2 missile interceptor, and other priority weapons for both countries. Thirdly, Australia has also sought to expand alliance technology cooperation through a combination of enhanced access to US technologies, new cooperative programs, and co-development projects for emerging technologies. For instance, in late 2020, Australia and the US upgraded cooperation on air-breathing hypersonic weapons through the Southern Cross Integrated Flight Research Experiment, or SIFIRE, Allied Prototyping Program, an initiative linked to the US Hypersonic Attack Cruise Missile Program, which will see Australian fighter aircraft both test and ultimately deploy those weapons, and as of this week, will also see Australia co-produce those weapons on the Australian continent. Australia has also sought new defence industrial and technology partnerships with Japan and South Korea to meet immediate capability requirements, but also to foster a larger, longer-term presence of both countries' defence companies in Australia's defence industrial base. Both the Korean and the Japanese cases reflect a cultural shift across the Australian defence industrial policy spectrum away from an absolute preference for Western military capabilities and vendors towards a greater appetite for alternative, albeit interoperable suppliers. With Japan, Australia's selection of the Megami-class frigate to fulfill its Tier 2 surface combatant requirement has been heralded as a watershed moment both for Australian defence policy and for the bilateral special strategic partnership more broadly. The Megami frigate clearly met Australia's immediate capability and delivery requirements, but its selection also bolsters and adds a missing industrial and technology component to the rapidly growing bilateral defence agenda. The agreement will initially see Australia procure 3 Megami-class frigates off the shelf before building the remaining 8 vessels in Australia, creating both a local production capacity and a means to support visiting Japanese naval forces, along with potential regional export opportunities in future. Crucially, we'll also see Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and an array of supporting Japanese companies establish a regular presence in the Australian defence market. With South Korea, Australia has awarded contracts to Hanwha Defence Australia to deliver new self-propelled howitzers and infantry fighting vehicles to the Australian Army, deals which included competitive local production, export, and technology transfer conditions, though the contracts for these platforms were reduced as part of the overall rebalancing of Australia's force structure following the 2023 DSR and 2024 NDS. Australia's historical preferences for European partners to supplement US capabilities and industrial capacity appear to be shifting. It's true that the UK's BAE and Spain's Navantia continue to support Australia's naval surface fleet requirements. Thales Australia remains the custodian of much of the country's national defence infrastructure, and Germany's Rheinmetall continues to locally produce some land capabilities for the ADF and for export. Yet recent years have also seen plans to acquire French submarines scrapped and the early retirement of European-designed helicopters, while Australia has opted to select Northeast Asian defence industrial suppliers over European competitors for the major projects that I just mentioned. One notable exception to this trend, I should note, has been the emergence of Norway's Kongsberg as a leading contributor to Australia's GUIO enterprise. It's not just at the bilateral level that Australia has sought to diversify its partnerships. Indeed, as Peter flagged before, AUKUS is perhaps the most prominent defence industrial and technology initiative on the Australian defence agenda at the moment. This work is intended to drive Australia's further integration with the defence industrial bases of both countries being the United States and the United Kingdom, of course, through the development of a shared workforce, technology sharing, supply chain resilience, and capability delivery on an accelerated timescale. Much as with the US-Australia alliance, AUKUS effectively connects efforts to build a more vibrant Australian defence industrial base with underwriting effective force posture initiatives and joint regional operations with allies and partners, the development of a more resilient and self-sufficient ADF, and supporting an enduring US military presence in Asia through larger and more direct contributions to key defence capability, supply chain, and technological initiatives. Through Pillar 1, the nuclear-powered submarine pillar, Australia has pursued a range of measures to prepare for the delivery of its own SSN fleet beginning in the early 2030s as part of the three-phase optimal pathway announced in March 2023. During Phase 1, Australia has sought to expand and upskill its national defence and defence industrial workforce to safely operate, maintain and regulate naval nuclear propulsion technology, including through bespoke technology transfer agreements, increasingly sophisticated maintenance engagements on US Virginia-class submarines, sending Australian officers and engineers for education in the United States, and co-crewing arrangements aboard US submarines where, by some estimates, every 1 in 10 sailors is now an Australian. This preparatory groundwork will enable Australia to take delivery of between 3 to 5 US Virginia-class submarines beginning in the 2030s under Phase 2 of the optimal pathway, and to prepare for the co-development and co-production of the future SSN AUKUS submarine under Phase 3. On Pillar 2, Australia has pursued a suite of advanced capability projects through a range of trilateral research, development, testing, and evaluation activities. In broad terms, these activities are focused on maximising the interoperability and efficiency of advanced capabilities already in service, identifying and coordinating on best-of-breed technology adoption, enhanced information sharing across multiple domains at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels, and regulatory and policy harmonization to streamline further cooperation, including ambitious reforms to export controls in all 3 countries to streamline defence trade. These activities have supported the development of Australia's defence industrial base through spotlighting Australian technological solutions, including those available in the commercial and dual-use sectors, for national and trilateral adoption, and galvanising Australian capital and technology to support defence priorities, sharing an evident synergy with the scope and objectives of ASCA. Now, I know we're just about at time, so I will jump to a couple of things that Pete and I think that Australia will need to grapple with as it puts together its next national defence strategy and defence industrial development strategy. First of all, there's a question of whether AUKUS will effectively eat the rest of Australia's defence budget. Australia must grapple with how to properly resource its defence industrial strategy in an uncertain economic environment. Perhaps more than alliance burden sharing demands from the Trump administration, internal Australian debates over defence spending are increasingly driven by concerns that without further stimulus, the national defence budget will be predominantly consumed with the cost of delivering Australia's nuclear-powered submarine capability through AUKUS. Australia's top military officer from 2005 to 2011 and the co-lead of the 2023 DSR, Sir Angus Houston, warned in November last year that AUKUS would, quote-unquote, cannibalise other capability priorities without a substantial increase in Australian defence spending above 3% of GDP. But such an increase is very unlikely in the near term. How, where, and on what timescale Australia allocates additional money in support of its full suite of defence projects, and not just AUKUS, will be a crucial consideration. The second thing to discuss would be the tension between the premium set on speed to capability versus the premium of defence industrial development within Australia itself. The single biggest challenge for Australia going forward will be reconciling a seeming major contradiction at the heart of its defence industry policy. An emphasis on minimum viable capability in the shortest possible time frame versus enhancing Australia's own capacity to produce and maintain a wider array of defence capabilities. The government is attempting to grapple with this challenge by breaking down defence programming and spending commitments into epochs, 2023 to 2025, which we're almost at the conclusion of, 2026 to 2031, and then 2031 onwards. In each epoch, the balance between off-the-shelf purchases and local innovation and produced content may change. But the key challenge for defence is balancing its investments into industry versus offshore sources, and this will remain a constant across those epochs. These challenges are already acute, with pressure already spread across the defence budget, and a large percentage of the 2024 integrated investment program consumed by big capability items like SSNs, frigates, and so forth, And these factors will continue to constrain the bandwidth to invest in new capabilities with agility going forward. This has also created tension within the Australian defence business community, with many small to medium enterprises arguing that too much investment and too much funding has and continues to go to big international prime defence contractors, and this would be at odds with Australia's incentives or reasons to try and develop a more vibrant defence industrial base of its own.